Hey everyone, welcome to video 1 of Business Performance, the CA new program. Chapter 1, we're going to be talking about performance management. So this is looking at businesses and understanding whether these businesses are actually achieving performance. So let's start off first of all, what is the definition of performance management, and introduce the chapter. So performance management is the use of measurement, such as KPIs, data analysis, to monitor, interpret, and diagnose strategic and operational goals. And this is really done to basically identify organizational performance, like are we hitting our goals? Are we hitting our long-term strategy for the business? Are we on the right track? And then from that, if we are deviating from that, achieving those things, identifying the things and the levers that we can actually pull and change in order to improve the underlying trajectory of the business towards those goals and strategy. So in order to measure, which is one of the key parts of the definition, we need to have a framework in place in order to evaluate the business in terms of whether it's going to hit those goals. So the terms that we're going to be using throughout this study guide, which are relevant to a framework, include the strategic direction, which is essentially the priorities of the organization to guide decision making and resource allocation. Number 2 is the goal, which is a actual tangible description of a result or outcome within a time frame, which is a puzzle piece of the broader strategy. So strategy is bigger picture, so it's long term where we want to go. You might have multiple goals required to hit that long-term strategy. KPI, or a key performance indicator, is a very specific quantification that provides evidence of whether a goal is being achieved over time. For example, sales targets could be a KPI, and if you hit enough of those KPIs over time for sales targets, you're going to hit your goal of being number one player in the market, or hitting $10 million in sales in 1 year. And if you hit $10 million sales along with all your other goals, you're going to hit your long-term strategy. Target is a specific KPI. So KPI is it's a measure, but a target is a specific number within the format of a KPI, so that we can actually say, okay, this is the KPI that we want to hit, essentially. Strategic initiative is an action or project undertaken in order to help reach a certain KPI target, which would of course then result in a goal being hit. And then objective is a statement that incorporates the KPI, target time frame, sometimes strategic initiative, which is designed to achieve a goal. So it's a statement, a text, which basically pulls in multiple of the things we discussed earlier. If we hit this sales target within 12 months, we're essentially on track to hit our strategic goal of being the number one player in Australia. Okay. So, now, in terms of, we've talked about a framework for evaluating goals. It's also important to have a performance evaluation system, which is essentially driving performance and evaluation of the system. And this should really link the strategic goals and direction of the company. It should flow through to the organization. It should align business units, and it should be clearly articulated in language that all employees can understand. The KPIs that we set as part of the system need to be realistic and achievable. There needs to be a time frame associated with them. You need to highlight unintended risks or consequences. For example, driving the wrong behavior with certain sales KPIs, like is that going to lead to discounting? Is that going to lead to aggressive sign up, which maybe gives you a bad reputation amongst your clients, etc. Okay, so when we're designing our performance evaluation system, there's a few steps or elements of this performance system. So number 1, I'll revisit these. So number 1 is design. Number 2 is setting the strategic goals and KPIs. Number 3 is communicating and cascading the strategic direction. Number 4 is implementing strategic measures and set targets. Number 5 is establishing strategic and operational dashboards. And finally, number 6 is evaluating performance and close any performance gaps. So let's revisit. So number 1 is designing the strategic direction. So this is looking at the internal business and the external business. It's looking at the overall environment and basically saying, okay, based on all these factors, these are the current priorities for the business in terms of where we want to head. So there are some existing models that we can rely on as part of this analysis. So for example, Porter's 5 forces, SWOT analysis, and PESTLE. And there are also in terms of models for designing a strategic direction, including the balanced scorecard, the triple bottom line, the Hoshin Kanri, and the McKinsey 7S. So the second step was around setting the strategic goals and KPIs. So where do we want to head for the organization, and what are the specific KPIs or specific numerical targets we need to hit in order to hit that broader, longer term strategy. So the goals are set during the same time as the strategic planning process, because those goals are very much linked to the strategy. They're the strategy broken into a few more understandable and achievable basically targets. So a common framework for setting KPIs is the SMART framework, and it's also applicable to goals. And essentially what it does is ensures that your goals and KPIs are really good goals and KPIs in the following perspectives. Number one, they're results oriented. So, rather than just being wishy-washy, is it actually linked to achieving something and achieving an outcome and a result? Number two, is it clearly worded, right? You don't want it to be long and fluffy so it doesn't make sense. It needs to be clear and concise so that it's more easily understood. Number three, is it specific and focused? It's very hard to achieve a goal if it's, again, very unclear and broad. But if you specifically say we need to hit 10 million sales, we know that's very specific and it's very easily measurable later on. Number four, is it realistic? There's no point setting goals which are clearly no one's going to hit. It's okay to have stretch goals, but they do need to be at least realistically achievable. Otherwise, people are going to be disincentivized by this. And number five, relevant. So there's no point setting targets about, let's say ESG or culture if the whole strategy of the business is really just trying to stay afloat and alive given cash flow crunch. So we need to consider what is specifically relevant to our business and tailor our goals and KPIs to the business. Number three is communicating and cascading strategic direction. So the whole thing about strategy is it takes a whole organization to achieve it. One person can't achieve a long-term strategy of a business. So that means the whole organization needs to understand it and understand their role and contribution in achieving that. So part of that is communicating it really clearly and ensuring the right people are involved and have buy-in. So it's also important when communicating this to the broader organization is clearly displaying the cause and effect relationship. So for example, breaking down each team. So sales team, for example, saying, hey, if you hit your goals of these sales, that's going to result in this revenue, which is going to result in us being the number one player in the market and us achieving the goal. So you give them the lever that they can control in their part of the organization, and then you link it to the broader strategy and show how they're connected. And that's going to motivate them. It's also going to encourage them and encourage buy-in into the broader strategy of the group. Number five is implement strategic measures and set targets. So this is all about, now that we know our strategy, we know our goals, how do we actually measure this at the detailed level for all of our organizational levers? And that means implementing KPIs, which are essentially numerical measures of achieving certain targets. For example, conversion of customers, number of emails sent out to customers, number of qualified leads, number of sales converted, right? So they need to be able to be communicated in numbers, so as a percentage or as a number or as a dollar, right? But they're not qualitative terms like, achieving a better culture. That might be more of a goal. A KPI is hitting an NPS score of, well, NPS can be measured, right? So it could be 70 NPS, could be 90 NPS. So it's important when you're developing each of these KPIs, and it's going to be multiple of them, to ensure it's clear how to implement it and as intended. So a basic KPI definition includes a formula to quantitatively describe how the KPI's values are calculated. Number two, the data requirements to provide the formula with all of the correct data. Number three, calculation frequency to set out how often the KPIs will be computed, and assumptions about what the KPI's calculation includes or excludes. Because the devil is in the detail, right? So thinking about, for example, if you're setting a target for employees about keeping wages as a percentage of revenue, how are we actually defining revenue? Are we pro formaing revenue? Are we including total revenue, or are we just doing recurring revenue? And for wages, are we including on-costs? Are we just doing direct wages? Are we including accounting accruals, for example, annual leave, long service leave? Because this is specifically going to drive the calculation. So we need to really understand what it is, because if it's things outside of people's control, they want to know that, they're going to make decisions based on this, so we need to be really clear about it. But ultimately what KPIs do is they basically provide almost a dashboard to routinely monitor the performance of the business relative to targets. So for example, we can track NPS over time. If NPS goes down, which is Net Promoter Score, it's basically a measure of, how happy people are in your organization, and for customers, would they refer your products to others? So you can measure that trend over time. If NPS is going down, you realize that something's going wrong in the business, you can investigate it. And it allows you to identify it early, ensure the businesses, you can still step in and ensure that the business is on track to hit its longer term goals and strategy. So we often do this via dashboards, so things like Power BI, etc., which actually visualize, the KPIs, they visualize performance gaps and things like that. And finally, evaluate performance and close performance gaps. So where a performance gap is identified, management need to develop a plan for closing it. So let's say an NPS target is 70, and we see that the business is on 60 and trending down from 65 and probably going to hit 50 based on our projection. So we realize that there's a performance gap there. We need to step in and do something. But what is it that we do? Well, essentially the essential stages to closing any gap, described by the PDA cycle, are plan, do, check, act, i.e. the PDCA. Plan. What is our plan? Let's be very specific about it. Figure out how we're going to close the gap. Do, actually going in and implementing the things in our plan. Checking in with management, checking with the people who are implementing it, checking the results. Is this actually change anything? Do we need to go back and adjust step 1 or step 2? And then finally, act. So if things still aren't changing, put some actions in place. Do we need to restructure the team? Do we need to take a different approach, right? So actually acting. Okay, 1.12, key performance indicators. So key performance indicators, we talked about this a little bit earlier. They're essentially the numerical measures or quantifiable performance measures of the business in order to achieve its goals and strategy. So what is a goal? What is a KPI? KPI is a quantification that provides objective evidence of the degree to which a goal is occurring over time. So the important parts of this definition include quantification. So how are we actually quantifying this? Because it needs to be calculated. So it can be in the form of a number, could be a percentage, could be a count, an average, or a ratio, but it needs to be in the form of a quantification. So it can't be like, culture is up based on feedback from team. No, it needs to be a specific number. NPS score is 70, down from 75 the previous month. Objective. So objective as in the sense of you're not biased by anything. So the KPI has a consistent calculation based on consistent and representative data. So it can't be influenced by anything. So it can't be influenced by, changing the way it's calculated over time. It can't have adjustments in there from management, right, which might influence. It needs to be objective, so not biased. Third, there needs to be evidence. It needs to be based on directly observable facts about the goal it's measuring, not on incorrect data. So as I mentioned before, it can't be based on assumption, it can't be based on hearsay, it needs to be based on pure data, because that's actual evidence. 4, degree. So the KPI values are measured on a continuous scale rather than a binary scale. So is culture good? Yes or no? No, it's not like that. It's measurable, right? Is it 78%? Is it 40%? Is it 50%? Right? If it's just yes or no, which is binary, it's not really going to tell you how the business is performing. And then finally, over time. We need to be able to measure this over time to be able to see trends. We need to know that trend because we need to know whether it's improving, whether it's getting worse, whether it's staying flat, whether it's better than before, and etc. So how are KPIs used? So KPIs are essentially aligned to your goals, and your goals are aligned to your strategy. So the KPIs are a powerful tool because when combined with targets, like for example, hitting a certain NPS, they enable companies to align operations, so the people actually pulling the levers in the business, with the key decisions of the strategic direction. They also allow us to understand the performance baselines, which is, what is normal in the business, what is it trending at, and also understanding the performance gaps. So how far away is that from where we should be or where we need to be in order to hit our goal? It also enables us to measure changes over time, as we discussed earlier, which is important to understand trend and where the business is heading. And it also allows us to understand and evaluate the effectiveness of actions, because with this trend over time, we can actually pinpoint when we did certain initiatives. So if we, changed our work week from 5 days a week to 4 days a week, we can go back to our NPS chart and say, okay, yes, this is when we did this strategic initiative. What was the outcome on the KPI we're measuring? Oh, NPS has gone up all of a sudden. Okay, it must be actually a positive impact of a initiative that we did. Or alternatively, if we do a bunch of pizza party days, which aren't actually addressing the core underlying issue of the culture and the business, we can see that the initiatives aren't actually having an impact on NPS. So therefore, that was probably an ineffective action by management. And then finally, it maintains focus on making decisions and taking the action in order to achieve targets. Okay, so how do we actually develop the KPIs? So before you're developing it, it's important to understand what is the goal that we're trying to measure. So is it improving culture, or is it about being the number one sales seller in Australia or New Zealand or globally, right? So it's understanding what is the goal, because the KPI allows us to measure the goal. So once we know what the goal is, we can select a number of KPIs. Typically, it's the minimum rather than a maximum, because the more data points that you have, as long as they're relevant, are going to be useful information. Okay, so there's 5 qualities that makes goals measurable. So the goals must be results oriented. So being the number one sales player in Australia, which is measurable, right? That might be $100 million sales a year. It must be clearly worded without ambiguity. It must be specifically about a single result. So you can have a different goal for a different result you want to achieve, but this goal must be about achieving a single result. Number 4, realistic about the influence of the team that owns it. And number 5, relevant to the strategy. Okay, so next is selecting evidence-based KPIs for the goal. So a KPI is quantitative evidence of the degree to which a goal is occurring over time. So we discussed that earlier. So how do we actually determine the process for choosing KPIs? Well, it's identifying the evidence, quantifying the evidence, based on what the data we have, write potential KPIs, and then with all of the list that you've come out, select the best ones which are most relevant and tell us the most useful data in order to measure our goals and strategy. Okay, so guidelines for writing a KPI. So as we discussed, it's important to be several things such as specific, consistent, measurable, etc. So here are some guidelines in terms of writing or composing each KPI. So it needs to be a statistic, so it needs to be a quantification. It needs to be a performance attribute, so the variable that is being quantified with the statistics, right? So not just a random number, but actually saying, okay, because NPS is down, this is indicating that performance on, customer service is bad. Next is the scope. So we need to be very clear about what's included in the calculation of the KPI. For example, are we including wage costs? Are we including on costs? Are we including accounting adjustments in terms of measuring wages percentage? And then finally, the frequency. Are we calculating it daily, weekly, monthly, fortnightly, quarterly, yearly, right? Because there's always going to be a trade-off. Yes, the more frequency, it's great. You get more timely data, but it might be a cost, either time cost or financial cost. There might be almost too much data, and maybe it's too detailed, right? If you're getting hourly updates, you might not need it that quickly, right? So it might be kind of overloading you with data that you don't necessarily need, whereas, quarterly might be relevant, or monthly might be might be the best. Okay, so what are some common pitfalls when developing KPIs? So number 1, expressing a KPI as a rate of change. So a rate of change is like acceleration, right, versus speed. So, if a company is coming from a terrible starting point, but they're getting back on track really quickly, that's the rate of change. But even though the rate of change might be high, the company might still be performing badly. So it's important to basically express the KPI as a equivalent of speed, right, as opposed to acceleration. I mean, there's no harm in having an additional KPI which does express it as a rate of change, but we do need to know fundamentally our KPI as a speed equivalent, which measures what our KPI is over time, not how fast our KPI is changing. Next is measuring individuals, people's performance. So typically when we're linking this to strategy, which is organizational kind of goal, or organizational goals, again, which is organizational wide, it's often outside of the control of any single individual. Therefore, when you're trying to set KPIs which measure whether the company is achieving KPIs, it doesn't make a lot of sense to measure individual people's performance most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. And it can actually be threatening to people. It can drive actions which you weren't anticipating, like people re-recording sales, or doing unethical things or things like that just to make the performance look good, or even manipulating the data, right? Or taking shortcuts. This can often drive unintended behavior. So next shortfall that can happen with developing KPIs is selecting KPIs without considering data feasibility. So we need to consider what data we have first and how we can use it, and then set the KPIs on that basis. Versus if we set the KPIs first and then work backwards from the data, it can often be a challenge in terms of not all the KPIs might be actually physically possible to calculate if we don't have access to that data. The next is selecting KPIs without considering the unintended consequences. And again, there's a famous quote from Warren Buffett, which is, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome," which essentially is saying, however you structure the incentive, people will go out and they'll achieve that outcome because they're incentivized to do so. And this can be negative because if you haven't considered all possible outcomes, including unintentional outcomes, there could be an unintended outcome which might be very bad for the organization, which you haven't considered. For example, with Wells Fargo in North America, they set bonus targets linked to number of new accounts set up. But what happened is bank staff ended up creating new accounts for fake customers, which drove up costs, ruined the bank's reputation, and cost them billions in fines, etc. All because of this was an unintended consequence they hadn't considered when they designed this incentive. Next is relying only on available data. So this is kind of contradicts an earlier point, which is without considering data feasibility. But if you only consider the data available in the organization, then you may be limiting yourself to an important KPI. So whilst it is good as a starting point in terms of what data you have, you should also consider, okay, what else do we think is really important that we don't have access to data, because we might need to spend money or time setting up a new data source. But if it is important enough, then we should really consider it. And then finally is making a committee responsible for a KPI. And essentially, when there's multiple people with ownership over something, a common issue is that no one necessarily takes individual responsibility for it. So it's the same with KPIs. So you often need a owner for the outcome, because that owner can then go and figure out what's going wrong, drill into it, because they realize that their ass is on the line if it goes wrong. Versus a team, there's less incentive for them to do that. Okay, so next section we're talking about balancing KPIs for a comprehensive performance improvement. So KPIs are great in terms of measuring an aspect of a business and its operation. However, if you only have a single KPI by itself, it's never going to provide a complete picture of performance. For example, wage percentage is going down. Is that because revenue is going down, or is it because of wages? And is it because of volume, or is it because of pricing and revenue? And is it for wages, is it because of efficiency, or is it because of cost of wages, and so forth? Okay, so so there's a couple of considerations here with KPIs in terms of categories of KPIs and balancing them enough of the different types to ensure we have a relatively complete and comprehensive understanding of the organization so that we don't get caught out by just having a single KPI or a single understanding. So the different categories of KPIs that we need to balance include strategic and operational. And these are the bigger picture KPIs that have a cause and effect relationship from operational to strategic. Then you've got your financial KPIs, which is they really show the relationship between the financial and non-financial KPIs and what drives performance. Then you've got your short and long-term KPIs. So if you're just focusing on short-term KPIs, you're not really have a good understanding of the long-term targets. And if you're just focusing on long-term targets, you're not really getting a good understanding of the short-term targets. So it's good to have a balance of those. And then finally, it's good to have a good balance of lagging and leading indicators. So lagging indicators are in the past. So for example, looking at your year-on-year growth in revenue, your wages, etc., that's lagging. But the downside of this, it's not very forward-looking. So if there's a trend happening in real time that we need to correct, what are we actually doing to correct it? So leading indicators are things that are like, for example, daily sales. If that's going down, that we know that once the quarterly results come out in a couple of months' time, that our revenue and results are probably going to be down. So, but by having that leading data, we can actually step in and action it relatively quickly. So it's good to have a combination of all of these things that balance together. Okay, so I've kind of explained all of these points, so I'm going to skip over that. So dashboarding, reporting to support decision making. So we kind of talked about this earlier in terms of what the KPIs are, setting up effective KPIs, but then actually being able to monitor them. So a common way that people and management actually monitor these KPIs is they set up these dashboards. So this is often done in Power BI, for example, but it's a visual screen which shows data in charts and forms. And it needs to be customized so that the relevant person in the organization has their own kind of customized performance report that's relevant, because, the questions it essentially needs to help management answer in the relevant department and relevant team is, where are the current performance gaps relative to you? What are the causes of the performance gaps relative to you? And how can the performance gaps be closed? So when building dashboards, there's a number of considerations to take into account to ensure that, the data is relevant to the user and it answers the question, these three questions up here. So before building a dashboard, we should really consider the following mistakes to understand them and to avoid them. So number one, we need to avoid including the wrong KPIs. Number two, we need to ensure that the KPI calculation frequency matches the reporting frequency. For example, if we need to do monthly reporting, but we're only calculating the data kind of quarterly, we're obviously reporting is not going to be, we're going to have trouble with our reporting at that point in time. Number three, it needs to include interesting content so that it actually, can help management answer it. They can get the information out of it. I guess the other possible mistake is using dials, gauges, and three-dimensional charts, right? There's multiple flaws with them, with those different types of charts. Dials, because I guess it's overly simplistic, it doesn't actually necessarily give you the data behind it, and it doesn't show you the trend over time. Same with gauges. And three-dimensional charts, I guess you don't really need three-dimensional charts for data plotting. You really just need two axes, which is the number and the time period. Clustering the dashboard with too much variation. So again, if the more information you have, it can, particularly for non-financial people, it can overload them. So sometimes you just need them to hone into a single number, the most important one, so that they can go and action it. Whereas if you just give them 100 different charts of different data, they won't know where to look, and the messaging will get lost. And then next is basing traffic lights on limited comparison. So traffic lights essentially say if something's good, bad, or okay based on green, red, or yellow. So depending on what we're comparing it to might actually give us the wrong outcome for those traffic lights. And again, those traffic lights don't necessarily give you a quantitative number like 72 NPS or over time. It's literally just, this is good, bad, or yellow. But how do you actually know that your judgment of whether it's good, bad, or okay is right? Okay. All right, so the first decision to make from a performance dashboard is which KPIs need attention first. So it's really driven by the size of the performance gaps. And again, what I said earlier is keeping it relatively simple and straightforward so that the information is communicated correctly and with limited confusion to management, based on the most important issues first. Okay, so identifying causes of KPI signals. Okay, so the fundamental question we're trying to solve with data analytics is, what is causing a performance gap? So our target for wages percentage is 40%. Based on our reporting, it's 45%. So what is causing that gap that we need to fix? So based on if you understand what's the nature of the causes creating the performance gaps, it helps you develop the appropriate strategy, execution, action, strategy to improve performance. So once we understand that, like, what's causing the gap, we know what the KPI is, we know what's causing the gap. The next step is, of course, to address those issues. And that involves designing, testing, modifying, and implementing strategic initiatives, change programs, or improvement actions, and then, of course, monitoring them to ensure that they are actually indeed closing the performance gap. So there's a number of different frameworks and models that we can rely on. A couple of common ones are the Lean Six Sigma, B, benchmarking, C, sprints, and D, agile. So we'll go through each of these in more detail. So Lean Six Sigma is essentially the combination of two methodologies. There's Lean and Six Sigma. So the Lean methodology focuses on eliminating all kinds of waste from business, whereas Six Sigma is more around statistical methods for reducing business process variation and improving process capability. So the benefit of this model is that it's a structured method that enables organizations to develop a deep understanding and control over their operational processes, and to close performance gaps. So with the statistical side, i.e. the Six Sigma side, it really uses scientific methods to ensure that the improvements that we're speculating can be proven, and that the changes will have a long-lasting effect. It also creates internal capability for employees and managers to diagnose and improve their own processes, and also engages employees by leveraging their knowledge and increasing their ownership of the price in the processes they work in. So some of the considerations when using Lean Six Sigma: so it does require training due to its rigor and reliance on statistical methods, which are a bit more scientific and maybe a bit more difficult to understand. It's also a very detailed and deliberate approach, right? As opposed to a more strategic or qualitative or big picture stuff. It's right in the detail, in the data. And finally, it's relatively strict process, which can be constraining for organizations that value innovation and creativity. So there's essentially a DMAIC principles behind the process of Lean Six Sigma. So DMAIC stands for the first letter of each of the kind of steps in the process. So it's define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. So define is so we know what the performance gap is, so our wages are behind. So what is the actual business process? So in this case, it might be business rostering our staff on. Maybe there's some inefficiencies there. Next is to measure it. So let's actually gather some data about the business process. Let's gather all the rosters for the business for every business unit for the last 5 years, and let's collect all the data. The next is, once we've got all the data, let's analyze it. So let's look at the data and the trends. Let's look at how the process works. So who's actually filling out the roster? Who's approving it? How is it calculating it? How is it assigning data into different kind of levels of award that calculates the cost? So let's really get a good understanding it. Let's also go back to the policies and procedures of the organization and understand the award as well. So let's look at the award at all the different rates. Is there certain times of day where it's actually much more expensive that we should be aware of? And then next is improve. So figure out what some solutions. So maybe it's because we're rostering inefficiently on Sundays. It's triggering, double time payments for a number of staff, where maybe we should either be closing the business or we shouldn't be staffing as many on those days. So that's the improvement idea. And then the final one is to control it. So after actioning it, just continue to monitor that KPI over time and see if the action actually results in the performance gap closing as a result of that solution we suggested. So next is benchmarking. So this is the second type. So we've finished Lean Six Sigma. The next type of model to basically analyze performance improvement is benchmarking. And benchmarking is essentially just getting data by looking outside your operation. So it's comparing to what others are doing, particularly kind of best practice, and saying, okay, where should we actually be at if we were operating as efficiently as the best in class in the industry. Now, this could be competitors, it could be nationwide, it could be international, it could be even outside of your industry. So it could be, if you're part of one group, what's our wage percentage? And then what's our main competitor? What's their wage percentage? Oh, theirs is much better than ours. Okay, that's where we should be at, basically. So there's 5 steps involved with benchmarking. So number 1, it's identify what to benchmark. So it could be your wages percentage, it could be number of employees, it could be how do you measure rostering efficiency. So figure out what we're actually benchmarking. Number 2 is identify which internal or external benchmarks can be used. So can we actually get that data? Is there a better measure? Should we be measuring a few other things like total wages, total revenue growth, wages, price increase versus efficiency increase? And then actually collecting that data so we can compare it. Next is setting targets. So now that we know what the best in class is, let's set that as a target. So let's set 40% wages as our target. And then the final step is to identify and implement those practices to get to that point. Okay, so the next model for identifying and correcting issues is sprint. So sprint is essentially a fast-paced improvement method that gives 5 days to design, prototype, and test ideas for solving business problems. So it's all about being very explosive, about being very quick, and basically coming up with ideas, designing, prototyping, testing ideas for solving business problems. So it's as opposed to the other methods, which are probably a bit more time intensive and resource intensive. So it could be a quick 30-minute meeting once a week with the CEO and the board, which is saying, okay, this is our list of problems. Where do we get up to? What are we going to do next step? You do a quick meeting, run through, and then the next week you do the catch up. Okay, where did we get to on these? Here are some more ideas. Here are some more problems. Let's monitor all of these. So it's kind of a more a rapid style way of moving things. It's particularly relevant for people at a senior level because they don't have as much time. So it's all about, having teams to help have hard to solve problems. So for example, the board may have some ideas at a high level, which kind of, one week they come up with this idea, the next week they come up with this idea, and so forth. Number 2, it's about quickly identifying solutions that are not likely to work before energy and time is spent on it, right? So if management had one idea of how to solve it, they speak with the board about it, they say, no, let's not do that. You're going to have this problem, and then they can, saves them a lot of time because they don't go down that route. And then it can also create a lot of energy and excitement for solving problems by kind of discussing it at a high level, talking about the solutions. It's, and also creates a culture of accountability and innovation. So some considerations for sprints. So, obviously there is a risk that the sprint team will not put enough rigor into the process because it is very quick discussion, as opposed to very detailed analysis, coming up with problem, solution, etc. It's just kind of talking big picture. The sprints require the team to be full-time with no distractions for 5 consecutive days. So, technically a sprint meeting, the way it is described is it's essentially 5 days to come up with a design, prototype, and test for a business problem. But, the business or management may actually, and the team on the sprint team may actually have other distractions for that week. They may not have time to fully dedicate it, as opposed to working on it slowly for a longer period of time in the background. And then finally, not every performance problem is appropriate for a sprint, right? The problem may require you to really get in the detail and understand it. So you could have a sprint meeting every day, which is more about like Monday, okay, let's just understand the problem. Tuesday, let's sketch out the solutions. Wednesday, let's decide on a solution. Number 4 is let's build a prototype. Number 5, let's validate and test it. Okay, so the next model we're going to talk about is the agile model. So this was initially a method for software development that put emphasis on the mastery of continuous change and the ability to adapt to disruption. So it's an iterative process, continuous process, which is all about being adaptive to change. So it's based on 4 core principles. So number 1, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Number 2, working software over comprehensive documentation. So it's about focusing on the software rather than spending time creating all these PDFs explaining how it works. It's like, let's go out and actually build something and be agile. Number 3, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Number 4, responding to change over following a plan, because plans change over time, particularly as disruption happens. So we need to be able to be very agile and adapt to it over time. Okay, so the benefits of being agile in the agile model is, it sees teams operate in a self-organized and collaborative manner, as opposed to a very command and control approach for project management, which is one person just following up a team. So some of the benefits of this is, it has a strong focus on customer needs as a driving force of change, which is going to result in a better product and better feedback. And next, it encourages collaboration with teams as opposed to, just one person, project managers assigning people tasks and then follow them up. Next, it speeds up improvement cycles by stripping out waste associated with things like bureaucracy, unnecessary meetings, rework, excessive documentation, etc. It also setting and testing hypotheses to determine what works and what doesn't, to avoid hastily rushing to the wrong situations. So some other considerations for using Agile. So typically it's more suitable for solving problems that are complex, novel, and uncertain, like changing over time. Like when you're building software, like you might have one idea as to what the final software looks like, but we realize that our competitors are working on something, or we speak to a customer and they say, oh, actually we don't want this feature and this feature, or we show them a demo and they're like, oh, can you add this and this and this? So there's a lot of moving parts and it's evolving, and even the technology behind it is evolving over time as well. People also need to be highly motivated, eager to learn and collaborate, comfortable taking iterative approaches as opposed to more prescriptive planning people. And more organizations have success by starting small with just 1 or 2 teams and letting the motivation and interest grow from their success as opposed to just rolling out across the business. So the thesis behind Agile is, that it should be based on 12 principles, which are essentially, number 1, the highest priority is to satisfy the customer. Number 2, changing requirements are welcomed at any time throughout the process. Number 3, deliver improvements frequently. Number 4, the improvement team and the business people work together daily. Number 5, build improvement projects around motivated people, trust and support them. Number 6, use face-to-face conversations, not emails and messages. Number 7, a solution that is working is the primary measure of progress. Number 8, the pace should be sustainable. Number 9, technical excellence and good design gets constant attention. Number 10, simplicity is essential. Number 11, self-organizing teams are the core of agile projects. And finally, number 12, the improvement of team constantly reflects on their process and improves it. Okay, cool. Let's talk about continuous business improvement. So essentially, evaluation and improvement of business is an iterative and ongoing process that mostly aligns with new strategic planning cycle. So these might occur each year, every 2 years, or every 5 years, depending on the organization. But there may be times when the organization faces major disruption, and that can be a trigger for an improvement cycle. So the operational performance measurement, and this starts where it goes into planning and the business plan and budgeting, etc., which we'll kind of cover in the next video. But basically, operational performance manager considers how an organization will achieve its strategic aims, so its long-term goals, on a day-to-day basis. So it's building up like a pyramid from the day-to-day to the midterm, to the short-term, to the midterm, to the long-term, to the overall strategy for the business. So as part of operational performance measurement, it's all about kind of balancing action with measurement, right? So for example, action without measurement leads to, you're going out and doing things without knowing what you're doing. You might be fixing the wrong thing or fixing something that doesn't need fixing, right? And that can lead to things like goal incongruence, sub-optimization, lack of quantification and accountability, resource inefficiencies, and value destroying. Whereas if you're all about measurement and you don't do any action, it's all about, it's paralysis by analysis. So maybe you're very good at understanding what's going wrong, but you're not very good at fixing it. It's also a very reactive culture, right? So you're reacting to problems as to, going ahead and doing what you think is best and creating the best pathway. It's sitting back and waiting until something goes wrong and measuring it and then communicating it, right? It can also be inefficient if you've got too many lagging measures like in the past versus leading. And this of course, can also lead to resource inefficiencies and value destroying, similar to all action. So it's all about a balance between the two, action and measurement. Anyway, that's the end of the first part, where we're just talking about KPIs, strategic management, and balancing operational action and operational management. So the next section will kind of talk about looking forward for the business's budget, planning ahead for the future, and the different types of budgeting strategies, etc. So we'll stop the video there, and we'll cover the rest in the next video. Thanks for watching.